Series 2 opens not in a courtroom or on a battlefield, but in exile, under empire. Persia was no liberator in the modern sense, but under its kings the Jewish people rebuilt their temple, recovered their laws, and reimagined their future, all while remaining subjects of a foreign crown. From Cyrus to Xerxes, the Bible's Persian kings aren't just rulers. They're tools of providence, figures shaped and deployed by a hidden hand. Today, we trace how those rulers were framed. The benevolence of Cyrus, the dangers of Esther's court, and the fragile line between favor and annihilation. Series 2, The Lion and the Flame, 25,000 years of relations, Israel and Iran. Start the machine.
Okay, here's a fascinating historical paradox for you. The deep roots of what we now know as Israel and Iran are intertwined, going back thousands of years. And not to a time of opposition, but to an era when Persian kings were seen by the Jewish people, often as liberators and patrons.
It's a perspective that's easy to lose sight of today, isn't it? I mean, modern lenses often obscure this ancient history, particularly the period under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, roughly from the 6th to 4th centuries BCE. Our sources, biblical narratives, historical analysis, and insights into Jewish identity, they paint a very different picture of this relationship.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to unpack the key nuggets from these sources. We're going to look at the relationship between the powerful Persian Empire and the Jewish community during this pivotal time, exploring the roles of key kings, the concrete support Persia provided for the Jewish return and rebuilding, and how this era profoundly shaped Jewish national and religious identity, both in the land of Israel and, well, in the diaspora too.
Think of it as understanding the foundational layers of a relationship that has changed dramatically over millennia. We'll start by meeting the Persian kings who appear prominently in the biblical accounts, like Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, and Esther.
Right. Then we'll move into the sort of nuts and bolts of the political and financial patronage Persia extended. And finally, we'll explore how all these experiences influenced Jewish identity and sense of nationhood, especially through the unique story of the Book of Esther.
It's a surprising and, I think, essential piece of history. Let's get into it.
All right, let's start with the kings themselves. The biblical sources introduce us to several Persian monarchs, and they frame their actions through the lens of God's purposes for Israel.
Yeah, they do.
The key figures are Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, who you might know as Ahasuerus, and Artaxerxes.
And the first, undoubtedly the most celebrated in the biblical accounts, is King Cyrus, often called Cyrus the Great. He's the founder of the vast Persian Empire and famously conquered Babylon in 539 BCE.
Right, which brought the Jewish exiles under his rule.
Exactly.
His single most pivotal action from the biblical perspective is that decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Ezra 1 and 2 Chronicles 36 frame this explicitly, stating Cyrus was stirred up by the Lord to make this proclamation.
And it wasn't just like passive permission either.
No. The texts say he returned the sacred temple vessels looted by the Babylonians and authorized resources for the rebuilding effort.
Yes, and the biblical portrayal is incredibly positive. Cyrus isn't just some pagan king. He's depicted as a divinely appointed instrument.
Yeah.
He even acknowledges the Lord, the God of heaven, in his decree, according to Ezra 1. It's presented as a direct fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy about the end of the 70 years of exile.
And the prophet Isaiah, writing much earlier, even astonishingly names Cyrus as God's anointed agent.
It's incredible.
Almost a Gentile Messiah figure, chosen specifically to subdue nations and enable the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. Isaiah 45, right?
That's the one, verses 1 to 4.
This prophetic naming really underscores his unique status in this narrative, a foreign king acting directly according to God's plan.
So Cyrus is the great liberator king who initiates the restoration. Next, we encounter Darius. Now, the Bible mentions two figures named Darius.
Right, this gets a bit confusing.
It can. There's Darius the First, or Darius the Great, who's central in Ezra, and then there's Darius the Mede in Daniel. They are distinct individuals.
Let's focus on Darius I first, the historical Persian king who reigned after Cyrus's successor. His role in Ezra is because the temple rebuilding had actually stalled for years after Cyrus's initial decree.
Yeah, ground to a halt. Then, in Darius's second year, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah spurred the Jews to restart the work.
Okay.
And when local officials questioned their authority, Darius I ordered a search of the royal archives. And what did they find?
Cyrus's original decree.
Exactly, supporting the temple project. This led Darius III to issue his own decree. You find this in Ezra 6, not only affirming Cyrus's order, but providing even more specific, tangible support.
This is key, isn't it? Darius's decree wasn't just permission, it was an imperial mandate for active support.
Active is the word. He ordered officials not to hinder the work, commanded that it be funded from the royal treasury's revenue in the province.
Wow.
And stipulated that supplies for sacrifices, animals, wheat, wine, oil be provided. That's Ezra 6, verses 8 to 10.
And he even added a severe penalty for anyone who tried to obstruct it.
He did. Serious imperial backing. And the outcome. The temple was finally completed in his 6th year, around 515 BCE.
Right, Ezra 6.15.
Which solidifies Darius II's place as a vital supporter who ensured Cyrus's vision was actually realized. His portrayal in Ezra is highly favorable, a just, conscientious ruler who facilitated God's plan.
Now, briefly, Darius the Mede is different. He appears only in the book of Daniel, described as receiving the kingdom after Babylon's fall. Daniel 5.31. He interacts with Daniel, throws him in the lion's den, and later decrees reverence for Daniel's God.
Yes, scholars widely view Darius the Mede as more of a literary figure, perhaps serving to bridge the timeline between Babylonian and Persian rule in Daniel's narrative, or, to highlight God's power over Gentile rulers.
So, not the same historical person as Darius I.
Right. There's no historical record of a Median king named Darius taking over Babylon before Cyrus the Persian did. He's distinct from the historical Darius I.
Got it. So Darius Thrace in Ezra is the key historical benefactor who ensured the temple's completion with tangible support. Darius the Mede in Daniel is more of a literary device illustrating divine protection through a foreign ruler's acknowledgement.
Well put. Both presented favorably in their specific contexts.
Next up is King Xerxes. The Hebrew text calls him Ahasuerus.
That's the name most people know from the Esther story.
Exactly. And scholars identify him with the historical Xerxes I, son of Darius I, who reigned from 485 to 465 BCE.
He makes a quick appearance in Ezra 4, doesn't he?
He does. It mentions accusations against the Jews in Jerusalem being sent during his reign, which indicates a period of renewed opposition and delays to the rebuilding.
Probably impacting Jerusalem's city structures, the walls maybe, rather than the temple itself at that point, since the temple was finished under Darius I.
Good point. But his primary role, the one everyone remembers, is as the central figure in the book of Esther.
Right, the whole story is set in his capital, Susa. It describes his vast empire of 127 provinces, a detail which is, historically consistent with the Achaemenid Empire's reach.
His character in Esther is, well, it's a mix of grandeur and maybe a bit of flattery and caprice.
Definitely capricious. He's the king who hosts those incredibly lavish feasts, dismisses Queen Vashti on a whim,
holds a beauty contest that leads to Esther becoming queen,
without him knowing she's Jewish,
and promotes the villainous Haman.
And he is so easily manipulated. Haman convinces him to issue a decree ordering the annihilation of all Jews across the empire. That's Esther 3.
And the king, maybe carelessly, perhaps just trusting his advisor, grants Haman his signet ring, giving the order imperial authority.
Completely unaware his own queen is among the condemned. It's high drama.
The turning point, of course, is Esther revealing her identity and Haman's plot at that banquet.
And the king's reaction is swift rage, leading to Haman's execution. But here's a plot device the book uses. The idea of the irrevocability of Persian law.
Right, Esther 8.8. The king can't just cancel the genocidal decree.
So the solution is a counter-edict. Xerxes allows Esther and Mordecai to issue a new decree, empowering Jews to defend themselves on the day the original decree was supposed to be carried out.
Count in Esther 8.
This leads to Jewish self-defense and victory, which is described in Esther 9, the elevation of Mordecai, and of course, the establishment of Purim.
His portrayal in Esther is just fascinating. He's powerful, but also sort of passive. His authority is wielded by whoever has his ear at the moment.
Yeah, he's not malicious like Haman, just easily swayed. Maybe credulous.
And the text subtly suggests divine involvement, like the king's insomnia leading him to read the Chronicles where he discovers Mordecai's past loyalty.
Right, Esther 6.1.
Using the king's whims for deliverance, even though God's name is never explicitly mentioned in the whole book.
Which is remarkable. And unlike Cyrus or Darius I, Ahasuerus isn't portrayed acknowledging Israel's God at all. The story feels very secular, set firmly in the Persian court.
Could that hiddenness of God's hand be a kind of commentary?
Possibly. A subtle commentary on how deliverance can come in unexpected, non-miraculous ways, using human actions and even a capricious king's decisions.
Interesting. Finally, King Artaxerxes, primarily identified with Artaxerxes of the Longimanus, Xerxes' son, who reigned from 465 to 424 BCE.
Artaxerxes presents a somewhat complex picture in Ezra and Nehemiah, doesn't he?
He really does. Initially in Ezra 4, he comes across as an obstacle. Enemies of the Jews send him a letter accusing them of rebuilding rebellious city walls.
And based on this report, he orders the work stopped, prioritizing imperial security interests, which makes sense from his perspective.
This halted Jerusalem's civic restoration for a time.
But decades later, the sources show a dramatic shift. Under the same king, likely Artaxerxes I, he becomes a major benefactor.
Yeah, first in Ezra 7, he sponsors Ezra's mission to Jerusalem around 458 BCE. His decree gives Ezra immense authority and support.
Immense is right. Funding for the temple from the royal treasury, tax exemption for clergy, and significantly, the power to appoint judges and enforce Jewish law, described as the law of the God of heaven, as provincial law.
That's huge. Ezra 7.2526.
It really was. A charter for religious freedom and legal autonomy, and Ezra explicitly thanks God for putting this desire in the king's heart.
And then later in Nehemiah 2, around 445 BCE, Artaxerxes sponsors Nehemiah, who was his Jewish cupbearer.
Yeah, Nehemiah asks to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, the very work Artaxerxes had previously stopped.
And this time, Artaxerxes says yes. He provides Nehemiah with royal letters for safe passage, grants timber from the royal forests for building,
and even provides a military escort. Nehemiah 2.7-9.
He appoints Nehemiah as governor, supporting him for many years. This is support for political and physical security, completely reversing his earlier decree.
So Artaxerxes is complex, initially influenced by enemies to stop work, but later acting as, maybe, a wise political pragmatist who ultimately grants extensive support.
And like Cyrus and Darius I, his later benevolence is framed biblically as divinely prompted.
Yeah, his story shows how a king's policies could change, and that petitioning the ruler, like Nehemiah did, was a valid path to gaining favor.
So to sum up the biblical view of these kings, Cyrus is the divinely chosen liberator.
The initiator.
Darius I is the funder who ensures the temple's completion.
The facilitator.
Xerxes is the capricious instrument used by a hidden providence.
The wild card, maybe.
And Artaxerxes is the complex but ultimately benevolent patron, enabling religious and civic restoration.
The long-term supporter. The consistent theme running through all of them, though, is God's sovereignty working through or over foreign rulers, even pagan ones, to achieve his plans for Israel.
Okay, great overview of the kings in the narrative. Now let's move beyond the biblical narrative alone in chapter 2 and look at Persian political patronage from a more historical perspective, bringing in external sources.
Right, adding context. The most significant external evidence related to Cyrus's policy is undoubtedly the Cyrus cylinder.
That famous clay inscription from the 6th century BCE.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It details Cyrus's general policy after conquering Babylon, restoring temples, and returning displaced peoples to their homelands. Importantly, he attributes his authority to various local gods, like Marduk in Babylon.
Now, this is because while the biblical decree for the Jews is very specific, the cylinder shows this wasn't some one-off favor just for them, right? It was part of a broader, calculated imperial policy.
A policy of tolerance and repatriation across his new empire.
So the cylinder doesn't mention Judah or the Jews specifically.
Correct.
But it strongly corroborates the historical plausibility of Cyrus's action described in the Bible. His general policy makes the biblical account entirely consistent with known Persian practice.
It was a strategic departure from Babylonian brutality, wasn't it?
Hugely different.
So Cyrus's decree, viewed by the Jews as this miraculous, divinely inspired act of liberation, was historically also a brilliant piece of pragmatic statecraft by the Persians.
Oh, so?
Well, by conciliating subject peoples, restoring local cults for stability, and contrasting themselves favorably with the overthrown Babylonians, they were building their empire effectively.
Makes sense. Moving to Darius I and the temple. We saw in Ezra that he confirmed Cyrus's decree and provided funding.
Yes, that active support from the royal treasury, detailed in Ezra 6, is a perfect example of Persian religious tolerance blending with pragmatic policy.
Pragmatic how?
Well, financing a provincial sanctuary like the Jerusalem Temple was a way to ensure stability, secure loyalty from the Jewish community, and maintain order in a region that was important for the empire's western frontier.
So it wasn't just religious piety?
Probably not solely. It was also sound governance from their point of view.
And while the temple's completion in 516 BCE under Darius was obviously momentous biblically,
Usually so.
you mentioned the sources note that Persian inscriptions don't really highlight it.
That's right. It suggests that from the vast empire's perspective, supporting the Jerusalem temple was likely seen as more of a routine, provincial expenditure and administrative matter.
Not something needing commemoration on, say, the Behistun inscription detailing Darius's own rise to power.
Exactly. But for the Jewish people, it was everything. It was the center restored.
And Persian support expanded significantly under Artaxerxes I, didn't it? Going beyond just the temple to legal and urban aid.
Yes, his support for Ezra's mission in Ezra 7, authorizing the enforcement of Jewish law, is a key example.
Empowering Ezra to enforce the law of the God of heaven.
Effectively granted a degree of legal and religious autonomy. And this aligns with known ecumenid practices. They often sponsored local cults and empowered local elites, like priests, as part of their governing strategy in diverse provinces, like Egypt, for instance.
And then for Nehemiah, in Nehemiah 2, the support to rebuild Jerusalem's walls and appointing a Jewish governor, Nehemiah himself, was another major step.
It really was. This shifted Persian policy from merely supporting religious life to actively enabling political and physical security for the city of Jerusalem.
And there was likely a pragmatic imperial angle to this too.
Almost certainly. Supporting a loyal Jewish province with fortifications and a trusted governor like Nehemiah create a strong buffer state on the empire's western border. Especially important given unrest like the frequent revolts in Egypt.
Right, that makes strategic sense. So Artaxerxes' patronage, seen by the Jews as this divinely prompted mercy, was also likely viewed by the Persian court as a shrewd political investment in a strategically important province.
Exactly. It shows how the same events could have both profound religious significance from one perspective and pragmatic political motivations from another. They aren't mutually exclusive.
So if we compare Babylonian and Persian rule, based on the sources, it really reveals a fundamental shift in approach that profoundly benefited the Jewish community.
Oh, absolutely. The contrast is stark.
Babylon's policy was brutal. Conquest, destruction, deportation, forced exile. They wiped out local rule, imposed direct control.
Persia's policy, kicked off by Cyrus, was dramatically different. Conquest, yes, but followed by restoration, permission for return, actual support for rebuilding local temples and cultural life.
And allowing a degree of local autonomy.
Right.
Even appointing local governors like Zerubbabel and Nehemiah, and authorizing enforcement of local laws like Jewish law under Ezra.
Babylon destroyed the temple, denied worship. Persia allowed and funded the rebuilding of the temple, supported the cult, even exempted clergy from taxes.
It's night and day.
Pretty much. Persian rule, with its blend of tolerance, support, and pragmatic delegation, was a significantly more humane and, frankly, effective form of imperial governance for subject peoples like the Jews compared to the Babylonian approach.
It didn't just end the exile.
No, it laid the groundwork for the flourishing of Second Temple Judaism. It was foundational.
Okay, we've explored the kings and the historical patronage. Now let's shift gears in Chapter 3 and connect this era of restoration under Persian rule to the vital process of shaping Jewish identity. How were the people themselves shaped by these experiences?
Well, the rebuilding of the Second Temple was central to this. It wasn't just a structure, it was a tangible symbol of God's restored presence.
Right.
And a marker of national continuity. Really vital for a people grappling with the trauma of exile and destruction.
And you mentioned there was even a flicker of messianic hope during this period, centered on Zerubbabel.
Yes, Zerubbabel was a descendant of King David who served as governor under the Persians. And prophecies in Haggai and Zechariah seem to hint at him having a special role.
Like what?
Well, Haggai calls him God's signet ring, and Zechariah talks about the branch. These terms suggest a hope, perhaps, for restoring the Davidic monarchy in some form.
But that didn't actually happen under Persian rule.
No, it didn't. But it shows the enduring hope for a renewed kingdom, even within the reality of living under imperial control.
But a truly unique dimension of Jewish identity shaped by the Persian era, especially for those not living in the land of Israel, comes from the book of Esther, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Esther is fascinating, and it's famously debated by scholars regarding its historicity.
Right. Is it history or something else?
The general consensus leans towards it being a work of historical fiction, or perhaps a novella. It's set in convincing Persian backdrop, but probably not a literal historical record.
Why do scholars say that?
Well, there's the lack of any mention of a Queen Esther or Mordecai or Haman, or this specific empire-wide genocide plot in other Persian or Greek historical sources from Xerxes' reign. like Herodotus. And there are also some internal details that seem a bit implausible from a strict historical standpoint, like maybe Mordecai's age or the scale of events.
However, there's always a however, isn't there?
There usually is. Many scholars note the author did have accurate knowledge of many Persian court details.
Such as?
The structure of the empire, those 127 provinces, court protocol, administrative practices like using royal chronicles, the multilingual communication, the courier system, things like that.
So it feels authentic, even if it's not literal history.
Exactly. It's likely truth-like in setting, using authentic details to make the fictional story feel real and relatable. Its importance isn't really diminished by its genre. Its purpose seems to be conveying deeper truths about Jewish life in exile and divine providence.
And this focus on identity and providence is key, right? What does Esther teach Jews living outside their homeland under foreign rule?
It offers powerful models of heroism and navigating complex loyalties.
Esther and Mordecai.
Yes. They operate within the imperial system. Esther as queen, Mordecai as a high official, but remain fiercely loyal to their people when it counts.
Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman.
A stand on principle.
And Esther's courage, risking her life to approach the king unsummoned.
A powerful example of using one's position, even a precarious one, for the good of the community. If I perish, I perish.
A unique theological aspect of Esther is the intentional absence of God's name, right? And no overt miracles.
That's right. It's striking. The deliverance comes through what looks like a series of coincidences. The king's insomnia, the perfect timing of Haman's plot being revealed just as Mordecai is about to be honored.
So how did people interpret that?
It points to the concept of Hester Panem, the hiding of God's face. It taught that God is present and active, even when his actions aren't obvious or miraculous.
So salvation can come disguised.
Disguised as human action or chance or political maneuvering. This became a really powerful theological framework for explaining Jewish survival in difficult, often hostile, diasporic environments throughout history.
And this links directly to the festival of Purim.
Directly. Most scholars see the book's primary purpose as providing the origin story, the etiology, for the festival of Purim.
Which ritualizes the story of deliverance.
Exactly. Through observances like reading the Megillah, the Scroll of Esther, giving gifts, charity, feasting, the command in the book to remember and not forget solidifies that communal memory.
And Haman becomes an archetype.
Yes, Haman, identified as an Agagite, a descendant of Amalek, the ancient enemies of Israel, becomes an archetype for future persecutors. Think about how often that pattern has been invoked later in Jewish history.
Purim provides a template then.
A template for understanding and enduring threats, reinforcing the message of survival and endurance, and Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. It teaches that deliverance is possible even in the darkest times, often through hidden means and human courage.
The story also seems to explore the tension of assimilation and separation.
It absolutely does. Esther marries a Gentile king. Mordecai becomes a high official that's deep engagement with the wider world. Yet when faced with an existential threat, they must assert their Jewish identity and stand apart. It highlights that ongoing challenge for diaspora Jews throughout history.
And the deliverance itself. It's different from, say, Daniel's lion's den.
Very different. In Esther, it comes through human action, political maneuvering, courage. In Daniel, you have overt miracles. Esther taught that God works through people. Human courage and wisdom are essential components of the story of salvation, alongside that hidden divine providence.
So putting it all together, the experiences under Persian rule, both the history documented in Ezra Nehemiah and the narrative dramatized in Esther, provided a powerful foundation for Jewish identity.
Both in the land of Israel during the Restoration and maybe even more profoundly for identity in exile. It offered hope, resilience, and a framework for understanding survival under foreign rule.
Emphasizing both that hidden divine providence and the absolute necessity of human courage and action.
Right. Bringing it all together, this surprisingly positive relationship, at least for a significant period, between the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the Jewish people.
Yeah.
We've seen how Persian kings like Cyrus, Darius I, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes played these very but crucial roles, often seen biblically as instruments of God's plan, enabling the return and rebuilding after the trauma of the Babylonian exile.
And we explored the historical reality of Persian patronage, those pragmatic policies of tolerance, repatriation, support for local cults, granting autonomy, which was dramatically different from Babylonian brutality.
That laid the concrete foundation for Second Temple Judaism and the physical restoration of Jerusalem.
And we've seen how narratives like Esther, even if we understand them as historical fiction, profoundly shaped Jewish identity, especially in the diaspora.
Teaching essential lessons about hidden divine providence, the importance of human courage, balancing assimilation and distinctiveness, and the enduring power of communal memory, ritualized through festivals like Purim.
This ancient history offers a really critical and I think often overlooked perspective on the long and complex relationship between the peoples of what are now Israel and Iran.
It really does. It highlights an era defined by unexpected support and cooperation, paving the way for centuries of Jewish life under Persian rule, which is, a world away from the current geopolitical dynamics.
It reminds us that relationships between nations and peoples are not static, are they?
Not at all. They're shaped by millennia of interaction, sometimes marked by profound conflict, but sometimes by periods of remarkable patronage and maybe even mutual benefit.
So, thinking about this deep history, this surprising era of Persian support for Jewish restoration, what does it tell us about the unpredictable nature of international relations, and how might understanding these ancient iterations reshape our perspective on the complex dynamics between peoples and nations today?
It certainly makes you think about how much things can change over time, doesn't it?
Under Persian rule, Jewish identity was neither lost nor fully restored. It was redefined. The temple rose again, but kingship did not. The covenant returned, but now written into scrolls instead of dynasties. What emerged was a new kind of nationalism, priestly, scriptural, and resilient, shaped under foreign rule, but rooted in divine promise. In our next episode, we follow that identity forward, as it begins to harden into law and exclusion and a radical new idea: holiness as survival.
Please like and subscribe.